In the heart of ancient Egypt, amidst the relentless sands and the eternal gaze of the Nile, stood the Temple of Isis, a place revered as a sanctuary of divine wisdom and sacred mysteries. Outsiders whispered tales of its grandeur, of the golden altars and intricate hieroglyphs that told stories older than memory itself. To the devout, it was a haven where the goddess of magic, motherhood, and the very fabric of life presided over those who sought her favor. Yet, beneath the shimmering veil of incense and sacred chants, a far darker reality pulsed quietly, hidden from the eyes of the faithful. The temple, a site of veneration, was also a crucible of control, a labyrinth where power and devotion intertwined in ways that would confound modern understanding. Women, drawn by promises of spiritual elevation, entered the temple not merely as devotees, but as participants in a ritualized hierarchy that demanded absolute submission. Their days, measured in prayer and ceremonial duties, were structured meticulously, leaving little room for personal autonomy. The very sanctity that should have protected them often became the mechanism of their subjugation, cloaking the temple's manipulations in the guise of divine will. It was here, in these gilded halls, that devotion transformed into duty, and duty into silent suffering, as the highest echelons of the cult wielded spiritual authority as a tool of subtle coercion. One can almost hear the echo of footsteps in the marble corridors, the soft murmur of hymns layered over unspoken cries, and feel the paradox of sanctity turned into surveillance. Each ritual, each blessing, and each sacred duty carried an undercurrent of power, an invisible leash binding the women not only to the goddess, but to the men who interpreted her will. The complexity of the temple's society was staggering. Loyalty was enforced not merely through fear, but through a cultivated reverence for a deity who demanded obedience above all else. And yet, even within this suffocating structure, fragments of personal resilience and quiet resistance flickered like fragile flames. Some women, entrusted with sacred knowledge, navigated the perilous boundaries of power with cunning and discretion, their survival dependent upon understanding the unspoken laws that governed both spirit and body. The shadow of the temple, though, was long and pervasive. To the casual observer, it was a place of piety and awe, yet for those within, the daily reality was a web of constraints, both spiritual and corporeal, from which escape was rarely imagined. These walls, adorned with symbols of eternal life, concealed instead a ritualistic prison, where each act of devotion subtly reinforced control, and each blessing carried a hidden price. As we step closer to unraveling the experiences of these women, it becomes chillingly evident. The sacred mystique of the Temple of Isis was inseparable from the calculated dominion exercised over its devotees. If you are intrigued by the hidden truths of ancient civilizations and the shadowed corridors of their sacred spaces, comment below, share your thoughts, like this video, and make sure to subscribe for the next revelations. Within the Temple of Isis, women were elevated in status, yet simultaneously ensnared in a complex web of subjugation. The promise of spiritual transcendence came at a steep cost, and the very title of priestess was both honor and chain. From the moment they were initiated, these women were bound to the rhythms and rules of a society that demanded unwavering devotion to the goddess and to the temple hierarchy. Their days were filled with ceremonial duties, ritual cleansings, and intricate offerings, each act meticulously designed to reinforce obedience and suppress personal desire. On the surface, they appeared empowered, wielding sacred knowledge and performing rites that connected mortals to the divine. But beneath this veneer of privilege A strict surveillance network ensured that no priestess strayed from the prescribed path. Every gesture, every whispered prayer was observed and assessed, not merely for spiritual correctness, but for conformity to the will of those who controlled the temple. The women were isolated from the outside world, their interactions carefully curated to prevent the intrusion of external influences that might spark rebellion or reveal hidden truths. In this cloistered environment, friendships were both lifelines and liabilities. Alliances could protect or betray, and the line between spiritual mentorship and coercive manipulation blurred. They were told that all their actions were sacred, that obedience itself was a form of devotion, and that any doubt or hesitation risked divine disfavor, not merely against themselves, but potentially upon the entire community. The psychological weight of this imposed piety was immense. A priestess had to navigate not only the demands of ritual, but also the unspoken expectations of a hierarchy that thrived on secrecy and control. Some adapted by internalizing the dogma, convincing themselves of the righteousness of their servitude, while others discovered subtle ways to exert influence, exploiting loopholes in tradition and ritual to carve out moments of autonomy. Yet the overarching truth remained. No matter how learned or skilled a priestess became, her life was circumscribed by the rules of a system that prioritized the temple's power above personal freedom. Even acts that seemed voluntary, prayers, offerings, symbolic gestures, were carefully monitored, reinforcing the notion that devotion and compliance were inseparable. The cult's leaders understood that to maintain absolute authority, they needed women who appeared free in spirit, but were tethered invisibly to the dictates of the institution. This duality, honor and oppression intertwined, was the defining feature of the priestess's existence. The sacred aura of the temple masked a relentless machinery of control, and every ritual, however beautiful, carried the silent echo of constraint. The women's lives, ostensibly devoted to divine service, were in truth a delicate balance of duty, manipulation, and survival, shaping not only their bodies and minds, but the very perception of holiness itself. The initiation rituals within the Temple of Isis were cloaked in symbolism, intended to elevate the women spiritually, yet their true nature revealed a far more insidious reality. Each ritual, outwardly, framed as a sacred journey toward enlightenment, concealed strict tests of obedience and endurance. The ceremonies often involved long periods of fasting, sleep deprivation, and exposure to the elements, presented as purifications but functioning effectively as methods of control. Novices were required to memorize complex hymns and perform intricate gestures under constant observation, where even the smallest misstep could result in public reprimand or ostracization. The high priests, wielding both spiritual and administrative power, monitored these trials, reinforcing the belief that the goddess herself demanded absolute perfection and submission. Beyond the physical and mental challenges, the initiation often included a psychological conditioning designed to sever ties with the outside world. Women were encouraged to renounce former attachments, to see their personal desires as obstacles to spiritual ascension, and to internalize a sense of dependency upon the temple and its leaders. In this crucible, fear and reverence became inseparable, and the line between devotion and coercion blurred. As the rituals progressed, priestesses were taught to read subtle cues in the temple's hierarchy, learning that obedience would be rewarded with privilege, while dissent, however mild, could be met with severe consequences. This environment fostered a paradoxical sense of empowerment and vulnerability. The women gained knowledge, skills, and proximity to sacred power, yet remained trapped within invisible chains. Even the most confident novices soon realized that their every choice was scrutinized, and the sanctity they sought was inseparable from the subtle manipulations of those who controlled access to the goddess. The rituals, though beautiful in form and symbolism, became instruments of psychological domination, reinforcing the authority of the temple's elite while instilling in the women a complex mix of awe, dependence, and fear. As they emerged from these trials, they were no longer mere outsiders or novices. They were fully integrated into a system that demanded total alignment with the temple's hidden agendas. Their spiritual elevation was inseparable from the loss of autonomy, and the lessons learned in these early rituals would shape their lives within the temple for years to come. The sacred rites, often described in later texts as mystical and profound, held a darker truth. The path to divine favor was paved with discipline, fear, and an intricate web of control, where the goddess's presence was both inspiration and instrument of subjugation. Beneath the surface of sacred chants and ceremonial grandeur, the Temple of Isis concealed a network of exploitation that few outsiders ever glimpsed. The high priests, guardians of arcane knowledge and arbiters of ritual, held absolute authority over the women entrusted to their care. Every task assigned to the priestesses, from tending the altars to performing the intricate rites, was a mechanism to assert control, reinforcing a hierarchy that placed obedience above personal agency. Surveillance was constant yet subtle. No explicit chains were needed, for the threat of spiritual censure was enough to ensure compliance. Within these gilded walls, exploitation was framed as devotion. Women were often pressured into acts that the temple claimed were sacred duties, blurring the boundary between service to the goddess and service to human power. The subtle coercion was psychological, as much as it was physical: isolation from the outside world, manipulation of fears, and the constant reinforcement of the temple's moral authority ensured that the priestesses internalized their subjugation as spiritual necessity. Secrets whispered in corridors and ritual chambers carried weight, shaping the dynamics of trust, loyalty, and fear. Alliances among women could protect or betray, and even the most devoted priestess found herself navigating a labyrinth of obligations that tested her endurance, resilience, and compliance. Some adapted, learning the coded language of the temple, the gestures and expressions that concealed dissent while signaling loyalty. Others, less able or willing, bore the brunt of punitive measures cloaked in divine rationale. This duality, veneration on the surface, oppression beneath, created a tension that permeated every corner of the temple. A hidden world where power and piety were inseparable, and survival depended upon mastery of both. As the women moved silently through ceremonial chambers, performing acts of devotion with precision, one cannot ignore the cost exacted upon their freedom, their autonomy, and their very sense of self. Their sacred environment was, in reality, a meticulously structured system of domination, a world where the goddess's presence justified acts that today would be recognized as abuse. The shadows of these halls were thick with secrets, the unspoken truths of lives lived under scrutiny, and the invisible chains of authority. It is a stark reminder that the divine and the despotic can coexist in spaces designed for worship. Share your thoughts below. Comment on what surprises you most about these practices, hit the like button if this revelation shocked you, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden darkness of ancient civilizations. Among the most unsettling aspects of the Temple of Isis were the sexual rituals, often veiled as acts of sacred duty, which served as both religious symbolism and instruments of control. These ceremonies blurred the lines between devotion and exploitation, merging mystical rites with acts that stripped the women of personal agency under the guise of spiritual necessity. The priestesses were taught that their bodies were conduits of divine energy, tools through which the goddess's favor could flow, and yet this theological framing masked the coercive manipulation at play. Initiates and seasoned women alike were subjected to ceremonies that emphasized obedience and submission, transforming intimacy into ritualized compliance. The high priests, custodians of ritual knowledge, dictated the boundaries, timing, and participants, ensuring that each act reinforced the hierarchy rather than personal connection. In these circumstances, the idea of sacred love was inseparable from domination. What was described as spiritual communion was often a performance where resistance was subtly punished, and acquiescence rewarded with acknowledgement and proximity to power. The women, conditioned to equate duty with piety, were taught to view these encounters as offerings to the goddess herself, internalizing the notion that personal discomfort or humiliation was a necessary step toward spiritual elevation. Over time, the constant imposition of these rituals created layers of psychological conflict, as the priestesses reconciled their human emotions with doctrinal expectations of purity, sacrifice, and divine service. The intricate symbolism of the temple, the gestures, words, and ceremonial artifacts, transformed acts that might have been purely physical into profound spiritual experiences in the minds of participants, while simultaneously reinforcing the authority of those who orchestrated them. For the women, survival required a careful negotiation of the sacred and the personal, balancing obedience with the need to maintain some semblance of inner integrity. Yet, even those who mastered this precarious equilibrium could not escape the reality that their bodies and desires were continually subsumed to the temple's hierarchical logic. The rituals, cloaked in mysticism, served not only to solidify spiritual identity, but also to entrench control, ensuring that devotion and subjugation remained entwined. In this context, the Temple of Isis was not merely a house of worship, but a complex arena where the spiritual and the carnal were weaponized to maintain power, shaping the lives, minds, and very sense of self of every woman who crossed its threshold. Within the walls of the Temple of Isis, isolation was a subtle yet relentless force. The women, though surrounded by the splendor of sacred halls and adorned statues of the goddess, lived in a world meticulously separated from the outside. The temple's hierarchy ensured that each priestess had limited contact with family, friends, or the wider community, effectively severing ties that might challenge the authority of the high priests. Surveillance was pervasive, silent. Observers, rituals of accountability, and coded signals maintained a constant awareness of behavior, thought, and compliance. Every interaction, even seemingly mundane, was monitored for signs of dissent or curiosity that might disrupt the delicate balance of control. The women navigated a hidden web of relationships, where alliances and rivalries could determine one's status, privileges, or exposure to punishment. These confined spaces, both physical and social, became arenas of tension, forcing the priestesses to learn subtlety, discretion, and manipulation to survive. Some found ways to assert minor autonomy, quietly bending rules without attracting notice, while others endured in silence, internalizing the temple's teachings as both spiritual duty and inescapable constraint. Knowledge of sacred rites, once a source of empowerment, could also become a burden, as understanding the mechanisms of control made it clear how deeply the women were ensnared. In this environment, obedience was the currency of safety, and fear, carefully intertwined with reverence, was the tool that maintained it. The isolation amplified the psychological effects of ritual, creating a sense of dependence not only on the temple, but on the very notion of the goddess, whose favor seemed intertwined with compliance. Every corridor, chamber, and hidden alcove was infused with authority, the architecture itself shaping behavior, reinforcing the sense that no escape was possible and that the boundaries of the temple were also boundaries of the mind. Within this crucible, the women's daily lives were orchestrated with precision. Meals, prayers, ceremonies, and rest were scheduled, punctuated by observation, and structured to cultivate both spiritual discipline and unquestioning submission. Yet, even amidst this relentless control, glimmers of resilience endured. Some priestesses learned to navigate the system with strategic cunning, to observe without being observed, and to retain fragments of autonomy in moments invisible to the hierarchy. The temple, though outwardly a place of divine wisdom, was simultaneously a prison of ritual and surveillance, where every aspect of a woman's existence was subtly managed, and every choice, whether conscious or coerced, reinforced the structure of power that permeated every stone, every chant, and every shadowed corner of its sacred walls. Hidden within the temple's shadows were stories that few chroniclers dared to tell. Former priestesses, those who had survived the relentless demands of ritual, surveillance, and manipulation, whispered accounts that exposed the grim reality behind the gilded facades. Their testimonies painted a picture of a world where devotion was inseparable from control, where acts of worship often concealed coercion, and where the authority of the high priests was absolute and unchallenged. Some recounted the meticulous rituals that tested not only their bodies, but the very essence of their willpower, forging obedience through a combination of fear, reverence, and isolation. Others described the alliances and betrayals that shaped daily life. Friendships could shield a woman from punishment, yet the same bonds could be weaponized to enforce conformity or exact revenge. These narratives reveal the human cost of what outsiders saw as sacred practice, the quiet suffering endured behind the ceremonial masks, the personal sacrifices hidden beneath hymns and incense. For many, the realization that the goddess's favor was intertwined with the temple's hierarchy brought both clarity and despair. Their spiritual elevation was inseparable from the systemic subjugation of their own autonomy. The high priests, aware of the power of secrecy, fostered an environment where stories circulated only in whispers, and those who dared speak too loudly risked expulsion or worse. Yet, even within these constraints, fragments of resistance and resilience emerged. Some priestesses learned to navigate the perilous dynamics with strategic subtlety, using knowledge of rituals and hierarchies to protect themselves or others. Others left the temple entirely, carrying with them memories that would challenge the sanitized myths of divine benevolence. These shadows, unseen by pilgrims and worshippers, hold critical insight into the lived experience of women within the cult of Isis, exposing the tension between devotion, exploitation, and survival. It is through their testimonies that we confront the unsettling truth. The Temple of Isis was not merely a place of worship, but a complex theater of control, where spiritual practice and psychological manipulation were intertwined inextricably. Share your thoughts below in the comments, reflect on what you found most shocking, and join the conversation about these hidden histories of power and devotion. When comparing the practices of the Temple of Isis to other Egyptian cults, it becomes clear that the severity of control and manipulation within Isis's domain was exceptional. While other cults employed strict hierarchies and ritualized obligations, the combination of isolation, sexualized rites, and psychological conditioning in Isis's temple created a uniquely oppressive environment for women. Many temples maintained formalized roles for priestesses, Yet few imposed the level of constant surveillance or enforced obedience that characterized the Temple of Isis. Even within elite cults, the emphasis was often on knowledge, ceremony, or public service, rather than the subtle coercion that wove itself into every aspect of daily life for the Isis priestesses. The integration of sacred symbolism with control mechanisms was particularly pronounced. Devotion, ritual, and fear were merged into a seamless system that normalized exploitation under the guise of divine will. This contrast highlights the complexity of religious life in ancient Egypt, where spiritual authority could be leveraged as a tool for both elevation and subjugation. While some cults emphasized mystical education or social prestige, the Isis temple uniquely intertwined physical, psychological, and social dimensions of power to maintain dominance over its female devotees. The women who served in other cults might enjoy greater freedom within their spiritual duties. Yet the priestesses of Isis were constrained at every level. In their bodies, their interactions, and even their thoughts, all guided by unspoken rules enforced through ritual and hierarchy. Comparative analysis also reveals that the public perception of sanctity often masked these darker realities. To the outside observer, the Isis temple's grandeur and devotion seemed emblematic of piety and divine favor, obscuring the subtle forms of control that shaped the women's lives. The apparent uniformity of Egyptian religious practice belied the underlying differences in how power was exercised and obedience maintained. In examining these contrasts, it becomes evident that the experiences of women in the Temple of Isis were not merely another facet of ritual life. They represented a distinctive form of structured subjugation, wrapped in the rhetoric of spiritual duty and sanctity. This context deepens our understanding of the historical reality, revealing that the temple's legacy was shaped as much by the unseen mechanisms of control as by its public expressions of worship, and that the reverence of outsiders often concealed a harsh and relentless system of domination within. The legacy of the Temple of Isis is a study in contrasts between myth and reality. Over centuries, stories of divine wisdom, magical rites, and sacred devotion painted the temple as a bastion of spiritual enlightenment. Yet the lived experiences of the women who served there tell a far more troubling story. The public narrative celebrated sanctity, opulence, and the revered presence of the goddess, while the private reality was marked by coercion, surveillance, and exploitation. Rituals that were celebrated in grand processions and hymns often concealed subtle forms of control that shaped the very fabric of a priestess's life. Women learned early that compliance was intertwined with spiritual approval, that their bodies, voices, and choices were instruments of both devotion and subjugation. The stories that filtered out of the temple were often sanitized, leaving generations to inherit myths that obscured the psychological and physical demands placed upon the priestesses. In historical records, inscriptions, and later accounts, the temple appears as a place of learning and piety. Yet these sources rarely capture the nuanced pressures, hierarchies, and secret manipulations that dominated women's lives behind closed doors. The interplay between public reverence and private suffering illustrates the complexity of power in sacred spaces. What was visible to pilgrims was only a fragment of the lived truth. Understanding this duality requires reading between lines of ceremonial description and piecing together whispers of first-hand experiences, revealing a system that operated as both a center of religious devotion and a meticulously managed apparatus of authority. The broader historical implication is striking. The Temple of Isis challenges our assumptions about sanctity, suggesting that the veneration of the divine could coexist with human cruelty, and that myth-making was often complicit in obscuring the exploitation endured within sacred Walls. The women's lives, shaped by ritual, hierarchy, and unspoken rules, remind us that history is rarely as it appears on its surface, and that the shadowed corners of even the most revered institutions often hold truths far darker than any legend suggests. The myth of sanctity, however, is inseparable from the reality of control, and the legacy of the temple is a testament to the resilience, suffering, and ingenuity of the women who endured its hidden demands. As we reach the conclusion of this journey through the shadowed halls of the Temple of Isis, the scale of what the women endured becomes undeniably clear. Beyond the gold-plated altars, the sacred chants, and the meticulously preserved rituals lay a world governed by power, control, and psychological manipulation. The priestesses' devotion, once thought to be purely spiritual, was inseparable from a system that monitored, isolated, and exploited them at nearly every turn. Even the most revered rites, framed as pathways to divine enlightenment, served as instruments to reinforce authority and limit autonomy. Yet within this oppressive structure, the human spirit persisted. Some women found ways to resist, to preserve fragments of selfhood and agency amid relentless demands. Others bore the weight of conformity silently, navigating the intricate balance between survival and spiritual aspiration. The Temple of Isis thus stands as a stark reminder of the duality inherent in sacred spaces. The same place that inspired awe and devotion could also conceal profound suffering. By examining these hidden histories, we gain insight not only into the nature of ancient Egyptian religious practice, but also into the ways power and sanctity can intertwine, for better or worse. The lessons of these women resonate across time, challenging us to question the narratives of holiness, obedience, and authority that are often taken at face value. Their stories compel reflection on the unseen costs of devotion and the resilience required to endure what history may forget or conceal. If you found this exploration as revealing and unsettling as we have, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories, share your thoughts in the comments below, and prepare to delve even deeper by watching the next video in our series on the shadowed realities of ancient civilizations. The darkness of the past is never far from our understanding, and by confronting it, we illuminate the complex interplay between faith, power, and human endurance.